The wind tore across the high plains like a living beast, shrieking against the boards of a lone cabin that sat crooked under the weight of the storm. Snow drove sideways through the darkness, lashing against shutters that rattled as if eager to give way. Inside, Helen Carver stood stiff by the hearth, her thin frame wrapped in a faded shawl, one hand gripping the barrel of a shotgun. The lantern at her table wavered with every blast of wind, throwing quick, shivering shadows across the cabin walls. Then it came, the pounding, heavy, urgent, knuckles or fist hammering the wood of her door like they meant to break through. Helen froze, the sound ricocheting through her chest. Out here in the middle of the night, no good ever followed such a knock. Her breath smoked in the frigid air as she crept toward the door. The pounding came again, louder this time, followed by a hoarse voice carried on the storm. "For God's sake, open!" Helen's fingers whitened on the shotgun. She drew a steadying breath, lifted the iron latch, and pulled. The hinges groaned. The storm punched through the opening, and in stumbled a man, tall but gaunt, a cloak rimed with ice, eyes hard and sharp as flint. He staggered 2 steps and collapsed onto her floorboards, snow melting into dark puddles beneath him. "Close the door," he rasped, his breath visible, his voice a growl dredged from exhaustion. "They'll smell the firelight." Helen slammed the door shut against the wind and leaned back on it, the shotgun still raised. She studied the stranger curled on her floor. His face was raw from the cold, beard crusted with frost, one hand clutched at his side where the cloth was stiff with blood. His silence was not the silence of a weak man. It carried weight, suspicion, a steady watchfulness even as his body shook. "You bring danger here." "Stranger," she said, voice low and tight, his head lifted, eyes burning through the dim light. "Danger follows me, whether I walk or fall." The storm howled outside, shaking the rafters. Helen wanted to order him out, to drag him to the door and shove him back into the snow. But the way he lay there, half dead, something in her chest tightened. She lowered the shotgun just a fraction, muttering under her breath. He coughed, tried to push himself up, and nearly fell again. Against her own sense, Helen stooped, pulled him toward the hearth, and covered him with a quilt. His body was all bone and sinew, skin chilled through. She pressed a cup of water to his lips. He drank greedily, then let his head rest against the chair leg. Outside, the storm carried a new sound. Hoofbeats. Many of them. Thunder rolling across the frozen earth. Helen stiffened. The stranger opened his eyes, a flicker of steel in them. "They hunt me," he whispered. The hoofbeats drew closer, horses snorting, riders shouting faintly through the storm. Helen crept to the window, heart hammering, and pulled the curtain back just enough to glimpse the horizon. Lightning flashed. Silhouettes of armed riders spread across the ridge like a dark wave. Her pulse quickened. Whoever this man was, his enemies were legion, and fearless enough to chase him through a blizzard. She let the curtain fall, pressed her back against the wall, and turned to look at him. He was already watching her, eyes unblinking as if measuring her soul. "What do they want?" she asked. His lips curved, not in a smile but in grim knowledge. "My silence." The storm rattled the cabin, snow pelting the glass. The hoofbeats slowed, men searching. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness. Helen's breath caught as a horse stopped just beyond the cabin. The sound of a rider dismounting, boots crunching in snow. Then the lantern flame sputtered and died. Darkness swallowed the cabin whole. In that suffocating silence, Helen heard it. A single bootstep outside, grinding into the frozen ground, right beneath her window. The storm had broken by morning, leaving the plains buried under a crust of white that glistened beneath a pale sun. Smoke curled from the chimney of Helen Carver's cabin, thin against the endless sky. She moved stiffly, shawl drawn tight, pouring water into a basin beside the hearth where the stranger lay stretched out on her floorboards. His breath rasped like a saw against green wood. Frost still clung to his lashes. His hands were raw, fingers cracked and bleeding from the cold. She set the basin down, reached for a rag, and knelt beside him. He stirred when she touched him, eyes opening just enough to track her face. They were dark, steady eyes, watchful even in exhaustion. She pressed the rag to his knuckles, cleaning away the blood and ice. His jaw tightened, but he didn't pull back. "You'll lose fingers if this sets in," she said. His voice came low, scraped by weariness. "Better fingers than my throat." She kept working, ignoring the weight of his stare. In daylight, his face showed more than the storm had revealed. scars faint along his jawline, the hard lines of a man shaped by long trails and hard bargains. His cloak steamed by the fire dripping onto her floor. She did not ask his name. She did not offer hers. Out here, names were sometimes the first thing to get you killed. On the mantel hung a locket, plain brass but polished by years of fingers turning it over. The stranger's gaze found it as if drawn. "Your man's?" he asked, her hand stilled. For a moment she said nothing. Then she closed the locket gently in her palm. "My husband's." Silence stretched. She felt the old ache settle in her chest again. She had buried Thomas Carver 3 winters ago, after he'd been cut down in a dispute over water rights and cattle runs. A bullet in the back while neighbors looked the other way. No trial, no justice, only whispers. Some said she knew more about his death than she ever told. Some said she'd struck the bargain herself. Those whispers had driven her out to this cabin at the edge of nowhere, where company came only when fate or trouble forced it. The stranger's eyes did not soften, but they did not harden either. "Men chase me for what I know," he said at last. Helen looked at him fully now, seeing more than the rags and the frost. She saw guilt and secrets clamped down behind a clenched jaw. She straightened, dropping the rag back in the basin. "You think I don't know what it means to be hunted?" she asked quietly. Something flickered across his face. He shifted, sat up against the chair leg, the quilt sliding from his shoulders. For a moment they watched each other in the hush of the morning, only the crackle of the fire breaking the silence. A sound came then, distant but sharp. The drum of hooves carrying over the hard crust of snow. Helen moved to the window, heart quickening. Beyond the ridge, shadows moved against the light, then came a voice carried across the brittle air calling her name. Clear, familiar. "Helen," she froze, blood running cold. Whoever hunted the tracker was not the only ghost the storm had blown to her door. The door burst open with a crash that rattled the frame, slamming against the wall so hard the lantern flame quivered. Helen jerked, her hand instinctively reaching for the shotgun leaning against the hearth. Snow gusted in with the intruders. 3 men, coats heavy with frost, revolvers glinting under the weak light. And behind them, filling the threshold with his broad shoulders and black hat, came Elias Vance. His presence darkened the cabin more than the storm outside. Vance's eyes swept the room, slow and certain, resting on Helen as though he had already claimed it. His mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite a sneer. "Afternoon, widow," he drawled, removing his gloves finger by finger. "Storm eased up just enough for us to pay a visit." Helen kept her chin high, though her stomach churned. "What business do you have barging into my home?" One of the deputies stomped the snow off his boots, the thud echoing through the small cabin. Vance ignored her question, stepping closer, boots leaving wet prints on her floor. His eyes swept toward the fire where a pair of damp boots sat drying. Helen's heart skipped. "We're hunting a man," Vance said, his voice steady, low. "A fugitive carrying papers that don't belong to him. Papers that could ruin good men. I reckon he came through this way." He tilted his head, gaze lingering too long on her face, on her hands gripping the edge of her shawl. "If you shelter him, widow, you'll swing for it." Helen's fingers brushed the locket at her throat, squeezing it tight as if it might steady her. She forced her voice into calmness. "I've seen no one. The storm kept me inside, same as any sane soul." Vance's deputies began moving through the cabin without invitation, kicking at shadows, lifting quilts, opening the cupboard. One leaned down toward the hearth, his hand hovering just above the stranger's boots warming by the fire. Helen's pulse hammered, but she stood still, every breath measured. "Best you tell the truth now," Vance murmured, his gaze flicking to the locket, back to her eyes. "You've been living on borrowed time since your husband went into the ground. Don't make me collect what's owed." The words sank like a knife. Helen's hand trembled against the locket, but she held her ground. "You'll find nothing here but an old woman's grief," she said evenly. A deputy snorted, overturning a chair before stomping back to Vance. "Place is empty." Vance's jaw worked, but he didn't press further. He turned, stepping back into the snow. The sound of his boots grinding against the frozen earth was slow, deliberate. He paused at the woodpile stacked neatly against the cabin wall. His eyes lingered, narrowed before he pulled his gloves back on. "Keep your fire burning, Helen," he called, not looking back. "Cold nights are dangerous." Then he was gone, his deputies following, the echo of their horses fading into the distance. The cabin sank into silence again, but Helen's body shook with the weight of what had just passed. She turned quickly, heart pounding, to where the tracker still lay beneath quilts in the shadows. His cloak had slipped partly open. Something stiff and stained protruded from the lining. Helen reached down, fingers trembling as she drew out a folded paper, edges caked with dried blood. She opened it slowly under the lantern glow. Her eyes scanned the crude signatures, the names, the false claims written in Vance's hand. A land deed. Proof of theft. Proof of murder. Her breath caught sharp in her throat. The truth lay bleeding in her hands. Helen sat rigid by the fire, the blood-stained deed spread across her lap, the parchment heavy with the weight of lives stolen. The ink had bled in places where snow or blood had smeared it. But the signatures were clear enough. Elias Vance's crooked scrawl, names of men long buried, boundaries drawn across land that had never belonged to him. Her throat tightened as her eyes traced one line. Her husband's cattle route struck clean through, marked instead with Vance's claim. She lifted her gaze to the man half hidden under quilts in the corner. His eyes were open now, watching her as though he'd been waiting for this moment. His silence was louder than words. She rose, crossing the room, and dropped the paper onto his chest. "You carry the truth men have died for," she said, her voice raw. He picked it up with slow, cracked hands, turning it once before letting it rest against his knee. "Truth," he muttered, a curse heavier than any saddle. His eyes, sharp even in his weariness, met hers without flinching. "I once rode under Vance, thought his fight was righteous, claimed he was bringing order to wild country. I believed him until I saw the smoke over homesteads, until I saw children starve where cattle once grazed. I turned then. Too late for your husband, too late for most, but not too late to carry this." He tapped the deed with a finger. Helen's heart hammered against her ribs. Rage, grief, and a strange pulse of hope tangled inside her. Harboring this man was no longer a question of mercy. It was a chance at justice, the kind denied her for years. Yet the thought chilled her too. If Vance discovered the paper here, if the tracker's presence was exposed, she'd not only lose her cabin, she'd lose her life. Her hand went to her locket, gripping it hard as if it might anchor her. She studied him, the shadow sharpening his gaunt features. For the first time she saw not just a fugitive, but a man scarred by choices, as bound to vengeance as she was to survival. "They'll come again," she whispered. "They will," he answered. His eyes softened only a fraction. "But you carry a fire they cannot extinguish." For a long moment the silence between them felt less like a gulf and more like a bridge. Something unspoken, sharp, and dangerous settled in the air. Then a sound split the stillness, a dull thud against the barn wall outside. Helen flinched, crossing to the window. Through the crack of the shutter she saw a sudden bloom of light, orange licking against the night. A torch hissed in the snow, flame catching dry straw. The barn was burning. Her breath froze in her chest. Vance was tightening the noose. The night sky glowed red where the barn once stood. Flames clawed upward. Sparks carried high into the dark until they vanished into smoke. Helen stood outside, the heat pressing against her face, the acrid stench of burning hay and timber filling her lungs. She could hear the frightened whinnies of horses loosed into the night, their silhouettes fleeing across the snowbound plain. The barn crackled and groaned as it caved in on itself, a shower of embers rising like fireflies into the cold. Villagers had gathered at the edge of her yard, drawn by the blaze. Their shapes were half hidden in smoke and torchlight, whispers curling through the air. The widow cursed by her husband's feud, the woman who drew trouble like a storm cloud. Some crossed themselves, others shook their heads. Not one stepped forward to help. Fear of Elias Vance kept them rooted to the shadows. Inside the cabin the tracker leaned against the doorframe, his face carved with firelight, eyes reflecting the blaze. He watched her watching the villagers. His voice was low, calm, but edged with finality. "Let me go. They won't stop until I'm in the ground. No sense you burning with me." Helen turned to him, her shawl pulled tight against the wind, hair whipping loose around her face. For a heartbeat she said nothing, her gaze locked on the ruin of her barn, on the whispers that slid like knives through the cold. Then she shook her head slowly. "They already took my husband," she said, her words carrying more steel than sorrow. She stepped closer to him, her hand brushing the locket at her throat. "I'll not hand them my soul." The tracker studied her, something fierce flickering in his eyes, though he did not smile. He understood perhaps better than she did the cost of defiance. His hand tightened around the blood-stained deed. the paper crumpling under his grip. "Then you've chosen your ground," he murmured. Helen looked back toward the villagers, the fire reflecting in their wide eyes. She knew how the whispers would spread. By dawn, every tongue in town would wag with fresh tales of the widow harboring the hunted, of curses carried on the smoke of her burning barn. Vance would take their silence as permission to close the noose tighter. But for the first time in years, she felt something other than grief knotting in her chest. Rage, resolve, a fire no torch could smother. She turned back to the tracker. If it's my ruin they want, then let them come and see what ruin costs. Inside the cabin, the shadows stretched long. The tracker placed the deed back in her hands, his voice low as gravel. "Then we stand together." Unseen beyond the corner of the cabin, a figure shifted. One of Vance's deputies, sent ahead with orders to watch, had crept close under cover of the firelight. He pressed himself against the wall, listening. When Helen's words rang clear into the night, the deputy's lips curled into a thin smile. Quiet as a fox, he slipped back into the darkness, his boots crunching faintly on frozen ground as he made for his horse. By the time the last of the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks, he was already riding hard through the night, bound for Vance with the widow's promise burning hotter than the fire behind him. The air inside the cabin had grown thick with smoke from the ruined barn, a haze that clung to the rafters and stung the eyes. Helen sat at the table, the blood-stained deed lying flat before her. The edges curled from damp, the ink still stark in the lamplight. She ran her thumb across her locket, its brass surface warm from the fire. Slowly, with a steadiness she did not feel, she folded the paper tight and slid it into the locket's hollow chamber. When it clicked shut, she pressed it against her chest, breathing hard. If Vance wanted to bury the truth, he would have to rip it from her throat before the eyes of the town. She knew the danger, but she also knew silence had starved her too long. Behind her, the rasp of steel carried through the hush. She turned to see the tracker sitting near the hearth, sharpening a long, worn knife against a whetstone. The sound was steady, patient, the kind of rhythm a man kept before riding into certain blood. Shadows from the flame danced over his gaunt face, carving it into something grim and eternal. "This place won't hold them," he said without looking up. "Walls are thin, doors weaker. They'll come with fire or lead." "Then let them," Helen answered. She wrapped her shawl tighter, forcing her voice to stay firm. "I've hidden the deed. They'll have to face me in daylight before witnesses. No more whispers. No more shadows." The tracker's hand slowed, the knife catching firelight. His eyes lifted, and in them she saw something rawer than defiance. Guilt. "There's something you don't know," he said, voice rougher than the whetstone's scrape. "I carried out Vance's orders once. Rode hard for him, took his coin, called it law." He paused, the knife trembling slightly in his hand. "I put a bullet in a man who never drew iron. Innocent. Father of 3. Vance said he was a thief. He was nothing but a farmer standing his ground." Helen's chest tightened, her fingers clenching around the locket. For a heartbeat, she thought she might throw him out, banish him into the cold where his ghost belonged. But the look in his eyes stopped her. The hollow years of silence, the way the guilt had carved deeper scars than frostbite ever could. "My silence," he whispered, "was bought with his blood. I've carried it like a brand ever since." He set the knife down gently as though it had turned to glass, his gaze fixed on hers. "If silence is the price, I'll pay it, but you deserve more." Helen trembled, the weight of his confession pressing heavy. Yet she did not move toward the door. She did not cast him out. Something in her, long buried under grief, refused. "Then let your guilt serve us both," she said, her voice low, trembling yet steadying with each word. "If Vance carved you hollow, we'll make that hollow ring with truth." The silence that followed was broken not by words but by sound, a deep, rolling thunder that shook the ground. Hooves. Dozens. Maybe more. The earth trembled beneath them as riders closed in. Lanterns bobbed in the night like hungry eyes. Helen's breath hitched. The siege had come. Vance was at her door. The morning broke pale and brittle, the kind of dawn where every sound carried sharper in the cold. Helen's wrists ached from the rope biting into them as deputies hauled her forward, her boots dragging ruts in the frost-hardened earth. Behind her, Elias Vance rode tall on a black gelding, his shadow cast long across the snow-swept ground. The clop of hooves and the jingle of spurs echoed down the narrow street as they entered town, and shutters cracked open just enough for eyes to peer out. By the time they reached the square, a crowd had gathered. Farmers with their caps in hand, shopkeepers with aprons still dusted from the morning's work, children clutching their mothers' skirts. Fear kept them silent, but curiosity pulled them close. They whispered to each other, words like treason, betrayal, cursed widow, rolling low across the square. The deputies shoved Helen to the steps of the old gallows platform. A frayed rope dangled from the beam above, swaying slightly in the breeze. One of the men began to knot it fresh, tugging to test its strength. Vance dismounted slowly, each movement deliberate, his eyes never leaving Helen. He looked her over the way a butcher studies stock, lips curved in something crueler than a smile. His voice carried smooth and steady across the square. "This woman," he announced, "has given shelter to a fugitive, a killer who rides against the law and against good men. She consorts with traitors, hides them beneath her roof, dares spit on the justice of this town. For that she'll answer with her neck." The crowd shifted, uneasy. A boy cried out and was hushed. Helen's breath came sharp, her heart hammering, but she forced herself to stand taller. Her eyes found the sheriff, an older man, once her husband's friend, now Vance's shadow. He looked away when she met his gaze. "Got nothing to say, widow?" Vance taunted. Her hands trembled against the rope, but she forced her voice steady. "I do." She stepped forward until the deputies tightened their grip on her arms. "You call me a traitor. You call him a killer. But the truth you fear isn't in us." She raised her chin, eyes flashing. "It's in you." A ripple of murmurs stirred through the crowd. Vance's jaw flexed, his eyes narrowing. Helen lifted her locket, fingers fumbling at the clasp until it sprang open. With shaking hands, she held the folded paper high. Gasps rolled outward as she let the deed unfurl. The names, the signatures, the boundaries, all laid bare in the weak sunlight. "This," she cried, her voice raw but rising, "is proof. Proof you forged land rights. Proof you stole cattle runs. Proof you murdered my husband and buried the law beneath your boots." The sheriff stepped forward uncertainly, eyes darting to the deed, then to Vance. The villagers pressed closer, whispers turning sharp. Vance's smile thinned to a razor's edge. "Lies." "It's his hand," Helen said, thrusting the paper higher. "Every one of you knows his mark." As if on cue, a figure broke from the edge of the crowd. The tracker stumbled forward, battered, face cut and bloodied, but alive. He pushed through the deputies, his voice hoarse yet carrying. "I rode with him. I saw it done. Families starved, land stolen, men gunned down for standing in the way. He's no lawman. He's rot wearing a badge of power." The murmurs swelled into shouts. The sheriff's lips pressed thin, sweat glistening on his brow. Vance's face hardened to stone, his hand sliding toward the revolver at his hip. Helen's voice rang out again, cutting through the noise. "This man carries truth," she said, nodding to the tracker. Her gaze locked on Vance, fierce as fire. "And you carry rot." The crowd went still. The sheriff's hand twitched near his holster, torn between loyalty and fear. Every breath in the square held tight. Vance's fingers closed around the grip of his revolver. His arm shifted, smooth as a snake uncoiling. And then, with the silence of a hangman's drop, he drew the gun level with Helen's heart. The square held its breath. Vance's revolver gleamed cold in the morning light, its barrel steady as it pointed straight at Helen's chest. His eyes burned with the certainty of a man who had always bent the world to his will, who had never once paid for the blood on his hands. For a frozen heartbeat, time seemed to stall. The rope swayed gently above, the crowd stood locked in silence, and Helen felt the world tighten around her throat. Then the crack of gunfire split the dawn. The tracker moved first, throwing his body forward, revolver drawn in a blur of motion. His shot rang out, sharp and final, the sound echoing off clapboard walls. Dust burst from the gallows steps as Vance staggered back, shock flashing across his face. His own gun fired wild, the bullet splintering a post inches from Helen's head. Another shot from the tracker thundered, striking true. Vance's snarl froze in place, twisted between rage and disbelief before his knees buckled. He collapsed into the dirt, his revolver slipping from lifeless fingers. For a moment, the town stood stunned. Then noise erupted, shouts, cries, the sharp clamor of boots. Some villagers cheered, their voices breaking with relief. Others scattered, terrified of the chaos justice might unleash. Deputies wavered, their loyalty splintering in the face of a dead master. Helen's knees gave, but she caught herself on the post. Her breath came ragged, her eyes locked on Vance's body lying in the dirt. The man who had stolen her husband's life, her land, her years of peace gone in a heartbeat of smoke and fire. The tracker staggered toward her, blood seeping fresh from his side where a bullet had grazed him. His hand shook as he holstered his revolver. Helen caught him as he swayed, pulling him close, her shawl pressed against his wound. Their eyes met. The bond between them no longer forged of silence but of survival, of scars that would never fully heal. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling. He gave a grim smile, weak but fierce. "Not enough to bury me yet." Her fingers tightened on his coat, the locket pressing between them like a brand. "I bartered my heart for silence," she said, voice breaking into something stronger, steadier, but found my voice instead. For the first time, the tracker's eyes softened, as if her words had lifted something from him that even vengeance could not. He leaned close, his breath warm despite the cold. "Then hold on to it. Don't ever let them take it again." By the time the sheriff gathered himself, declaring in a faltering voice that justice had been served, the tracker was already pulling away. He mounted a horse left riderless in the fray, his frame hunched but unbroken. He looked once more at Helen, long searching, then spurred the animal forward. The crowd parted as he rode through, some blessing him, others cursing under their breath. Helen stood rooted, her shawl flaring in the wind, watching until he vanished over the ridge. Around her, the town began to shift, voices rising with questions and fear, but none dared touch her now. The widow who had faced Elias Vance and lived was no longer a woman to be pitied, but a figure marked by fire and defiance. When she returned to her cabin that night, the wind howled fierce through the plains, rattling the broken shutters. She stepped into the doorway, lantern light spilling across her face. No longer the widow in exile, no longer the woman buried in grief. She stood tall against the storm. She had faced power and lived. The seasons turned, carrying the ashes of that winter into memory. Spring brought rain that softened the scorched ground where the barn had fallen, coaxing green shoots through the blackened soil. By summer, fresh timbers rose, stronger than the ones before, hammered into place by hands no longer afraid to be seen helping her. Men who once whispered against her now came forward, grudging respect in their eyes as they cut lumber, mended fences, and shared tools. The widow's land was no longer cursed, it was reborn. Children's laughter carried across the yard where silence had once lingered heavy. They played along the fence lines that had been stolen and reclaimed, chasing each other in the dust, their shouts ringing brighter than any church bell. Helen stood often at the doorway, watching them with a faint smile, her shawl loose around her shoulders, the locket warm against her chest. It still held the deed, but now its weight was different. Not a chain of grief, but a talisman of justice earned. At sunset, she would walk the ridge, her boots pressing into earth that had nearly been lost. The horizon burned gold and crimson, the wind lifting her hair as she gazed over the land her husband had died for. The pain remained, sharp in places, but it was no longer hollow. It had filled with purpose, with memory, with something close to peace. Sometimes, in the hush between day and night, she thought of the tracker. She saw him in her mind's eye as he had ridden away, battered, bloodied, yet upright in the saddle, carrying his ghosts into the distance. His presence lingered like a shadow at her side, not haunting but steady, a reminder of sacrifice and loyalty carved in silence. She never knew if he lived still, but his absence was as alive as his memory. Helen touched the locket as the sky deepened to purple. Her silence now was not forced upon her by fear or shame. It was hers to keep, hers to break, a choice. The land beneath her boots, the home rebuilt from ruin. None of it bought with gold or law, but with courage wrested from the fire. The plains stretched endless before her, a promise and a warning. For all her victory, she knew the frontier's battles never truly ceased. There would always be another hand reaching too far, another man willing to take what was not his, another fight rising over the horizon. As the last light dimmed, she caught sight of movement far to the west. A lone rider, just a speck against the dying sun, moving slow but steady toward her land. She stood at the ridge, wind tugging at her shawl, watching as the figure drew nearer. The frontier still breathed, restless and unfinished. And Helen Carver, widow no more, stood ready,